The rain did not fall. It attacked. It came in horizontal spears, driven by a wind that had left nothing behind in the high desert but the scent of ozone and shattered juniper. The sky over Juniper Mesa was a bruised, rolling purple, and the sound it made against the cabin was not a drum, but a fist. Asher Vale stood on the porch of Raven's Bluff, his world reduced to the 10-foot circle illuminated by the single lantern hanging from the eaves. The wind found the flaws in his wool coat, stinging his face and hands, whipping his beard against his jaw. He was a man carved from the same rock as the mesa, broad in the shoulder and quiet in the eye. And he watched the storm with the resigned familiarity of an old acquaintance. He was known in the territory. On the rare occasions he was spoken of at all, as the Lonely Rancher. It was a name he had earned and, in a way, cultivated. He leaned against one of the support posts, his weight testing its anchor in the rock. Solid. He'd sunk it 3 feet deep himself. He scanned the roofline where the slate, hauled at great cost from the railhead 60 miles east, met the chimney stack. No gaps, no leaks. Not yet. The high desert was a place of absolutes, and it demanded constant, grinding vigilance. With a final look into the screaming black, Asher turned and entered the cabin. The door shut with a heavy, final sound, the thick wood cutting off the storm's roar to a muted howl. He bolted it, a habit, not a necessity, not usually. His movements were economical, each one with a purpose. He hung the heavy coat on a peg, the water already pooling on the stone floor beneath it. He moved to the weapon rack by the door and lifted his Spencer carbine from his shoulder, hanging it on its dedicated hooks. The metal was cool, familiar, an old weight he knew better than any human touch. He lit the main oil lamp on the central table. The flame caught, steadied, and pushed a warm, amber light into the corners of the single large room. It was a soldier's room, not a home. The floor was swept clean. A single cot was made with tight, perfect corners. The books on his shelf were few but well-worn geometry. Histories, a worn Bible he never opened. His first duty, now that the perimeter was secure, was to the only other living souls at Raven's Bluff. He pulled on a dry slicker, unbolted the door, and stepped back into the tempest, lantern in hand. The wind nearly snatched the door from his grip. He fought it closed and made his way to the lean-to stable built against the cliff face. He slipped inside, the smell of hay and horse and dry wood a comfort. "Easy, boy," he murmured. A low nicker answered him. Dustwing, his big buckskin gelding, stamped a hoof in the dry bedding. Asher ran a hand down the horse's flank, checking for dampness, for the tremors of cold. The gelding was dry and calm. In the next stall, Kestrel, his rangy pack mule, was already half asleep, chewing methodically. "Good, both of you." He checked their water, topped off the hay, and leaned against the stall door for a moment. The lantern held low. The stable was the one place that felt like an indulgence. It was tight, warm, and safe. He had been a cavalry scout for 6 years. He knew, in a way most men did not, that your life was not your rifle. Your life was your mount. The discipline of that life had never left him, though the army had. It was in the way he folded his blanket, the way he cleaned his skillet, the way he trusted only what he could see and service himself. He returned to the cabin, bolted the door for the second and final time that night, and shed the slicker. The storm was worse now, the wind finding a new, high-pitched voice in the chimney flue. He stoked the pot-belly stove in the center of the room, adding 2 split logs of piñon. The wood caught, and the stove radiated a solid, metallic warmth. He moved to the corner of the room, to a small, heavy chest made of dark piñon wood. It was the only object in the cabin that was not purely functional. He did not open it. He did not need to. He knew its contents by heart, a liturgy of loss. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a daguerreotype. A woman, faded and formal. Her hair pulled back, a small, forced smile on her lips. A child, a boy of 3, squinting in the studio light. held on her lap. Sarah and little Eli, dead, both of them. Not here, in this clean, hard country, but in the flat, humid green of Kansas, wiped out by a swamp fever that had turned their skin to fire and their lungs to water. He had been away, scouting a rail path. He had returned to 2 new graves and a silence that had followed him west, a silence that had become his shadow. That chest was the scar, the physical proof that this emptiness was not his original state, that the man known as the Lonely Rancher had once been someone else entirely. A sound cut through the wind. Asher froze. It was not the storm. It was not the house settling. It was sharp, frantic. Someone was at his door. He did not call out. He did not hesitate. His hand went to the Spencer on the rack. Lifting it free, the motion was liquid, practiced. He thumbed the hammer back halfway, the click almost imperceptible. He moved to the side of the door, out of the line of any bullet that might come through the wood. The sound came again, louder, a desperate, open-palmed pounding. Not the hard rap of a man, but something more chaotic. He stood for a full 30 seconds, listening. Only the wind and the rain and the frantic hammering. No voices, no horses. He kept the Spencer angled down, his left hand on the door bolt. He drew a breath, held it, and slid the heavy bolt back. The door swung open a bare 6 inches, held by the security chain he'd forged himself. The lantern light fell on a mass of wet rags and dark hair. He pulled the door open another foot, leveraging his body behind it. 4 women stood huddled on his porch, shrinking from the lantern light. They were Apache, their calico skirts and patched blouses plastered to their bodies, soaked to the skin. They looked less like people and more like drowned animals, their black hair matted with rain and mud. One, the tallest, stood slightly forward. Her face was set, her eyes black and wide, searching his. Beside her, another woman, leaner, watched the darkness behind them, her head cocked like a hawk. A third was supporting a fourth, the youngest, who was shivering so violently her teeth were a constant, chattering drum. The girl's arm was wrapped in a crude bandage, a dark, arterial stain spreading through the wet cloth. Asher said nothing. His rifle remained at his side. The muzzle pointed at the floorboards, but his finger was on the trigger guard. The tall one spoke. Her voice was a low rasp, broken by the cold, but the English was clear. She stepped forward, forcing the others behind her. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw a terror so profound it had burned past screaming and settled into a cold, hard resolve. "We came to bed with you," she said. The words hung in the air, a different kind of violence. "We will do this, for shelter and protection." Asher's body went rigid. The rifle felt heavy in his hand. He looked from her face, impossibly young under the grime, to the bleeding girl she was shielding. He saw the hawk-eyed one's hand move to a knife sheathed at her waist. He saw the terror in the third woman's eyes as she tried to hold the wounded one upright. He looked back at the speaker. Seda. That was the name he would come to know. He saw the bargain she was offering. The only currency she believed she had left. She was offering to trade the last of their dignity for a few hours of safety from the storm, and from whatever was in the storm with them. The memory of the Pignon chest flashed in his mind, the image of Sarah, the weight of his loss. He shook his head. A single, sharp motion. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, but it did not break. "There is no trade for bodies here," he said, his voice flat. He unhooked the chain. He stepped back, pulling the door wide open. "Get inside. Get warm." He nodded at the bleeding girl. "We'll see to that wound first." For a second, none of them moved. They stared at him, uncomprehending. This was not the transaction they had prepared for. "Now," Asher commanded, his voice hardening, not in anger, but in urgency. The tall one, Seda, made the decision. She pushed the others forward, past him, into the warm, dry light. The hawk-eyed one, Chenoa, went last, her eyes sweeping the room, assessing him, the rifle, the exits, before she would turn her back on the night. Asher closed the door. He slid the heavy bolt home. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. The cabin was filled with the sound of chattering teeth and the drip of water. The four women stood on the stone floor by the entrance, a miserable, shivering cluster, looking small and broken in the lamplight. The potbelly stove roared. The warmth of the room began to fog the cold air they had brought in with them, the smell of burning pinon resin, of hot metal, and now of wet wool and fear, filled the small space. It was a fragile, impossible moment of humanity, bought with a bolt and a log fire, a temporary truce in the long war against the wild. Asher's response was not one of comfort, but of immediate, practical triage. "Blankets," he ordered, pointing to the dry stack on his cot. "Get out of those wet clothes and wrap yourselves. By the stove, all of you." He fetched his own medical kit, a worn leather roll that had seen him through 3 campaigns. He motioned to the wounded girl. "Onawa. Here, sit by the lamp." Onawa, the youngest, could not have been more than 16. She was trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor, shock glazing her face. The woman Asher would come to know as Tiva, her older sister, guided her to the stool, her movements fierce and protective. Tiva knelt beside her, holding her upright. "I am Tiva. This is Onawa, our sister," she said, her voice low and tight. Asher merely nodded. He brought the lamp closer. "Hold her still." He took a knife and slit the sodden bandage, peeling the cloth away. The wound was a deep, clean gash, running 4 inches along the outside of her forearm. It was not a bullet. It was a blade. It was dangerously deep, but the cold and the rain had slowed the bleeding. "This will sting," he said, without apology. He uncorked a bottle of whiskey, the last of his supply, and poured a generous amount onto a clean rag from his kit. Onawa gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and her whole body tensed as the alcohol hit the raw flesh. Tiva wrapped both arms around her sister's chest, pinning her to the stool, whispering to her in their own tongue, a fast, low chant of comfort and strength. Onawa buried her face in Tiva's shoulder, her knuckles white as she gripped her sister's arm. She did not scream. Asher worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly steady. He cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency. While he worked, the third sister, Chenoa, did not huddle by the fire. She moved to the cabin's single window, her body tense, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She wiped the condensation from the glass with her sleeve, peering into the black, rain-lashed night, her hand never leaving the hilt of the knife at her belt. Seda, the first to speak, had wrapped herself in a heavy wool blanket. She stood near the stove, letting the heat steam the damp from her black hair. She watched Asher, her eyes tracking his every move. "Who did this?" Asher asked. Not looking up from his work, Sida's voice was hollow. "Men who hunt people, they work for Silas Drummond." The name dropped into the quiet cabin like a heavy stone. Drummond. Asher knew the name. Every man in the territory knew it. Drummond was the railroad. He was the Copperjack Mine. He was the shadow that stretched from the capital to the border. A man who bought marshals and moved mountains. "They took us from our camp at Mescal Wash." Seda continued, her voice gaining a hard edge as the warmth returned to her. "They herd women, like cattle. They sell us south, across the border." Asher paused, pulling a suture needle and gut from his kit. He looked at Seda. "Slavers. They do not call it that," Seda said, her lip curling. "They call it contract labor for the haciendas in Mexico. But we are cargo. They told us that." She explained how the storm had hit their captor's camp. In the chaos of wind and horses, she and her sisters had cut 2 ponies loose and fled into the deluge, riding them until the animals collapsed. They had been running on foot for hours since. Asher turned back to Onawa. "This will be worse." He did not wait for an answer, pushing the needle through her skin. Onawa stiffened. A strangled cry caught in Tiva's shoulder, but she held. "Who's the man leading them?" Asher asked, tying the first knot. "Von Pike," Seda answered, and the name was heavy with a different kind of venom. "He was a sergeant. He said, like you." Asher's hand stopped, just for a second. He looked up, his eyes meeting Seda's. "How do you know me?" We have watched this bluff for a month, Seda said. We watch everyone. We see the way you move, the way you ride, the way you check your perimeter. You are cavalry. Like him. Chenoa spoke from the window, her voice a low growl. He is not like Pike. Pike is an animal. He is worse, Seda corrected. He is a businessman. He carries a leather ledger. He told us the price for each of us was written in it. He said he would get his price, or his bounty. Asher finished the last stitch and tied it off. He bandaged the arm tightly with clean linen. It will hold. Keep her by the fire. He stood and moved to the stove, stoking the logs. He felt the weight of their story settle on him. Vaughn Pike, a former sergeant, a man who tallied human lives in a book. The name, the description, the casual brutality of it, unlocked a door in Asher's mind, a door he kept bolted shut, just like the one to his cabin. He was suddenly not at Raven's Bluff. He was south, near the Pinyon Flats, 6 years ago. The sun was a hammer, the air thick with dust and the smell of hot alkali. He was in his blue Scout's uniform, the yellow chevron on his sleeve already bleached pale. Captain Hayes, a man with a politician's smile and dead eyes, was pointing at the small, ragged encampment of Pinyon families huddled by the dry creek bed. They were not at war. They were just there, in the way of the survey line. We need to make an example. Sergeant Vale, Hayes had said, adjusting his gloves. The survey chief wants this sector cleared by tomorrow. Burn them out. Asher had looked at the camp. He saw 2 old men, a half-dozen women, a child playing with a dog. Sir, Asher had said, keeping his voice level. They are not hostile. They are not even on the line. They are just hungry. They are an impediment, Hayes said, his voice flat. That is an order. Burn it. Show them the cost of squatting on government-surveyed land. Asher had looked from the captain to the families, and he had made the choice that ended his life. He'd slowly unclipped his rifle from its saddle ring and let it rest, muzzle down, on his boot. No, sir, I will not. The silence that followed was absolute. Hayes's face had turned a dark, mottled red. You are relieved of duty. Vale, you are finished. Asher had turned his horse, Dustwing, even then, and ridden away. He had been given a dishonorable discharge for refusing a direct order in the field. He had not been court-martialed. Hayes did not want the paperwork, the questions. He just wanted Asher gone. The shame of it was not the discharge. The shame, the thing that ate at him in the Pinyon chest, was that he had simply left. He had saved his own conscience, but he had not saved them. He had ridden 2 miles, heard the screams, and seen the smoke. He had abandoned the weak to a man like Hayes, and now a man like Hayes was coming to his door. A sound cut through his memory. It was not the wind. It was Chenoa, hissing. Light. Asher was at her side in an instant, peering over her shoulder. Far down the trail that led up the mesa, bobbing in the driving rain, were 5 pinpricks of light. Torches. They found the trail, Seda whispered, her voice cracking. The mud. We left tracks a blind man could follow. Asher's mind was clear. The past was gone. The decision was now. 5 riders, he said, his voice pure scout. They'll be here in 10 minutes. The sisters looked at each other. Their brief moment of safety shattered. Tiva grabbed Onawa, pulling her to her feet. Where? Where can we go? Out the back, Chenoa asked, already moving toward the rear wall. No, Asher said. They'll circle the cabin first. They'll expect you to run. You will not. He strode to the center of the room, to the large bearskin rug that lay before the hearth. He kicked it aside, revealing a thick, plank trapdoor with an iron ring. The root cellar. He pulled the door open, revealing a square of blackness that smelled of damp earth, potatoes, and cool stone. Get in, all of you. Seda hesitated. And you, they will find us. They are hunting 4 women, Asher said, his voice hard. They will find 1 man in his cabin, sitting out a storm. I am not what they are looking for. I will delay them. I will send them on. They will not believe you, Chenoa argued, her hand on her knife. "They will," Asher said, "because I will make them. Now, go, and do not," he commanded, his eyes locking on each of them. "Make a sound. I do not care what you hear. You do not move. You do not breathe. You are ghosts." Tiva and Onawa scrambled down the short ladder first. Chenoa followed, her eyes never leaving Asher's face, a look of profound, mistrustful calculation. Seda was the last. She stood at the edge of the opening, the lantern light illuminating her face. "They will kill you for hiding us," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "Get down," he said. She did not move. Instead, she reached for the leather thong around her neck. She pulled it over her head. Hanging from it was a small, tarnished brass tag, the kind used for baggage or freight. She pressed it into his hand. "I took this from him," she whispered, her voice shaking with a cold rage. "From Drummond himself. When he came to the camp, I ripped it from his coat." Asher looked down. His large, calloused palm was filled with the object. He held it to the light. Stamped into the brass were two simple letters, S.D. It was proof, a direct link. He closed his fist around it, the metal cutting into his skin. "Go," he said, his voice a rasp. Seda looked at him, her black eyes holding his, 1,000 years of history and pain passing between them. Then she turned and disappeared into the earth. Asher shut the heavy door. The sound was a dull thump. He dragged the heavy bearskin rug back over it, smoothing the edges, kicking the dirt on the floor to look natural. He moved to the table, sat down, and poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He placed his Spencer carbine on the table. Within easy reach, he was alone. The cabin was silent, save for the wind and the approaching hoofbeats. He thought of the women beneath his feet, their lives depending on his nerve. He thought of Pinyon Flats, of the smoke he had ridden away from. He thought of the brass tag in his pocket, a brand of ownership. He was a man who had run from one fight to save his soul. He would not run from this one. His vow was a dry, burning thing in his throat, spoken only to the storm. "Tonight," he thought, his hand resting on the cool stock of the Spencer. "I am not just stopping a massacre. I am saving them." The silence in the cabin did not last long. It was broken not by a knock, but by the brutal, splintering crash of a boot against timber. The heavy oak door, unbolted but still held by the latch, flew inward, slamming against the stone wall with a violence that shook dust from the rafters. Vaughn Pike did not walk into a room. He invaded it. He filled the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the storm, before stepping inside. 4 men followed him, bringing with them the freezing gale, the stench of wet horsehair, stale sweat, and cheap whiskey. They fanned out instantly, their movements aggressive and practiced, the habits of men used to kicking indoors and finding terrified occupants. Pike peeled off his dripping leather gloves, his eyes already dissecting the single room. He was a man who had once worn a uniform, but had shed the honor that was supposed to come with it, keeping only the brutality. His face was broad, scarred by smallpox, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points that twitched when he smelled blood or money. "Mighty foul night for a social call." "Vale," Pike said. His voice was a low rumble, grating like iron tires on gravel. He didn't look at Asher. He was looking at the floorboards, tracing the wet footprints that had not yet fully dried. Asher remained at the table, his hands flat on the wood, in plain sight. He did not stand. To stand would be a challenge. To remain seated was a calculated insult disguised as indifference. "It is," Asher agreed, his voice neutral, "which is why most men wait for an invitation before breaking a man's door hinges." One of Pike's men, a wiry weasel of a man with a wandering eye, snorted. He was already rummaging through the small pantry shelves, knocking tin cups to the floor. Pike ignored the comment. He walked slowly toward the stove, holding his hands out to the warmth, but his eyes never left Asher. "We are looking for lost property," Pike said. He turned his back to the fire, blocking its heat from the rest of the room. 4 head of livestock broke loose from our train at Mescal Wash. High-value stock, spirited, tendency to run. I have not seen any horses. Asher lied, taking a sip of his cold coffee. Not horses, Pike corrected, a greasy smile spreading across his face. Two-legged stock, Apache females, prime age, worth $100 a head across the Sonora line, maybe more for the young one, if she hasn't bled out yet. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and foul. He was watching Asher for a flinch, a twitch of the eye. Any sign of the moral weakness Pike despised in men he considered lesser than himself. Asher slowly set the tin cup down. I don't trade in flesh. Pike, you know that. And I don't keep company with those who do. Pike chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. Oh, I know you don't trade. Sergeant, you just sit up here on your rock, high above the muck the rest of us live in. St. Asher of the Mesa. He pushed away from the stove and began to prowl the room. He walked past the cot, past the pinon chest. He stopped at the rifle rack. Spencer, Pike noted, tapping the stock of the weapon Asher had just hung up. Good gun, Army issue. Seems you kept a few things from the old life after all. It kills bears just as well as it killed rebels. Asher said, I was up at High Notch since dawn, tracking a silver grizzly that's been worrying my herd. Just got back when the rain started. It was a good lie. High Notch was 10 miles north, opposite the direction the women had come from. It explained his weariness, the mud on his own boots, the rifle being out. Pike seemed to consider this. He looked around the Spartan, orderly room. It was exactly the kind of room a solitary man who had been hunting all day would have. A bear, Pike mused. Big one. Big enough? Pike nodded slowly. He looked ready to believe it. He looked ready to turn and leave, to take his foul-smelling pack of jackals back out into the rain. Then, his eyes stopped. They landed on the small, rough-hewn table near the stove. In Asher's haste to hide the women, in the adrenaline of the moment, he had cleared the bandages, the needle, the thread, but he had missed one thing. A single, small square of cotton gauze, no bigger than a coin, had fallen beneath the table. It was stained bright, fresh crimson. Pike walked over to it. He didn't bend down. He just pointed the toe of his muddy boot at it. That bear of yours, Pike said softly, his voice dropping an octave, losing all trace of mock civility. He must have bled something terrible. Strange that he did it right here in your kitchen. Asher's hand twitched toward the Spencer on the table. Pike saw it. His own hand dropped to the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. The 4 other men stopped their rummaging, their hands going to their weapons. The air in the cabin instantly solidified, charged with the deadly static that precedes gunfire. I cut myself skinning, Asher said. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. Did you now? Pike smiled. A true wolf's grin this time. Let's see your hands. Veil. Asher did not move. Pike laughed. He looked down at the floor again. He looked at the bearskin rug. It was slightly askew, just an inch off center from where it usually lay. You always were a terrible liar, Asher, even to the captain. That's why you never made rank. Pike snapped his fingers at the wiry man. Jensen, pull that rug back. Let's see what kind of root vegetables our lonely rancher is growing in his cellar this time of year. Jensen grinned, holstering his pistol to use both hands. He stepped forward, grabbed the thick fur of the bear hide, and heaved it aside. The trapdoor was exposed. Jensen reached for the iron ring. Asher braced himself. He had to wait. He had to wait until the very last second, to give them every chance to stay hidden. Jensen's hand touched the cold iron of the ring, and then, from beneath the thick wooden planks, came a sound. It was faint, muffled by feet of earth and timber, but in the breathless silence of the cabin, it sounded like a thunderclap, a cough, wet, weak, and unmistakably human. Onawa. The moment shattered. Pike's head snapped toward the sound, his mouth opening to shout an order. He never got the chance. Asher moved with the explosive, contained violence of a coiled rattlesnake. He didn't reach for the rifle on the table. It was too slow. He launched himself across the 6 feet separating him from Jensen. He hit the smaller man like a falling boulder, driving his shoulder into Jensen's chest with bone-crushing force. Jensen flew backward, smashing into the 2 men behind him, tangling them in a mass of limbs and cursing. Asher rolled. Coming up on one knee by the cot, Pike had his revolver clear of leather now, leveling it at Asher. Kill him, gut the bastard. Asher didn't go for his own gun. He went for the bed. He plunged his hand into the space between the mattress and the rope frame. His fingers closed around cold steel, not his own knife, but the heavy Bowie knife Seda had taken from his rack and hidden there, anticipating exactly this kind of close-quarters hell. Smart girl. His mind registered in a split second. He whipped the massive blade out just as the 4th man, a burly bearded brute, lunged at him with a drawn saber. Asher parried the saber stroke with his left forearm, taking a shallow slice, and drove the Bowie knife upward with his right. The blade sank deep into the man's thigh. The man shrieked and collapsed, clutching his leg. The small room was instantly a chaotic swirl of smoke and noise. Pike fired. The deafening boom of the heavy-caliber revolver in the enclosed space was physically painful. The bullet smashed into the stone fireplace, sending razor-sharp granite chips flying. Asher scrambled back, staying low. Using the heavy oak table as cover, he grabbed the Spencer now. He didn't aim. There was no time to aim. He just pointed the cavernous muzzle toward the doorway where Pike and the remaining 2 standing men were clustered. He pulled the trigger. The Spencer roared. A massive cloud of sulphurous white smoke filled the room instantly, blinding everyone. He heard a scream not of death, but of surprise and pain. He had hit something. Get back to the horses!" Pike's voice bellowed from the porch, choked with rage and coughing from the smoke. Asher worked the lever of the Spencer, ejecting the spent brass casing with a metallic shink clack. Chambering a fresh round, he fired again, blindly, through the smoke toward the door. Another cry from outside. The remaining men didn't argue. They scrambled over their fallen comrade, terrified of the madman in the smoke-filled box. They tumbled out onto the rain-slicked porch. Asher stayed low, listening. He heard boots splashing in mud, the frantic jingle of bridles. He crawled to the door, keeping beneath the level of the windows. He peered around the shattered door frame. Pike was in the yard, already in the saddle. One hand clapped to the side of his head. Blood was streaming between his fingers, washing down his neck in the rain. Asher's first blind shot had clipped his ear. Pike wheeled his terrified horse, his face a mask of pure, undistilled hatred visible even through the downpour. "You are dead, Vale!" Pike screamed over the wind, his voice cracking with fury. "You hear me? I will put a price on your head that will have every bounty man from here to Denver hunting you. You are a dead man." He savagely kicked his horse and galloped into the dark, his 3 remaining men streaming behind him. They left the wounded man moaning on the cabin floor. Asher watched them go until the darkness swallowed them completely. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. He slumped against the doorframe, his chest heaving. His left arm was stinging where the saber had grazed him. The cabin reeked of burnt powder, blood, and fear. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly not from terror, but from the adrenaline crash. He walked over to the man on the floor, who was trying to crawl toward the door, leaving a dark smear on the stones. Asher grabbed him by the collar and dragged him effortlessly onto the porch, leaving him in the shelter of the eaves, but out of the house. "Crawl back to your master," Asher rasped. "Tell him the price just went up." He kicked the man's revolver out into the mud. Then he went back inside. He heaved the ruined door shut and dropped the heavy wooden engaging bar into place. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold for now. He walked to the center of the room and kicked the bearskin rug aside again. He grabbed the iron ring of the trap door and heaved it open. The cool air from below met the acrid smoke of the room. 4 pale faces looked up at him from the darkness. Asher stood there, silhouetted by the dying light of the lantern. The bloody Bowie knife still gripped in one hand, the smoking Spencer in the other. He was covered in sweat, rain, and blood that wasn't all his own. He looked down at Seda. "You can come up now," he said, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable even to himself. The bargain was sealed, not with words, but with lead and blood. He had crossed the line. There was no going back to being the lonely rancher on the bluff. He was one of them, now hunted. There was no time for inventory, no time for grief over the violated cabin. The fight had bought them minutes, not safety. Pike was enraged and ashamed. Wounded Man was the most dangerous animal in the territory. "We leave," Asher said, his voice a low rasp. Jamming the bloody Bowie knife back into its sheath, he grabbed his saddlebags, emptying jerky, a pouch of coffee, and a box of cartridges onto the table. "Everything you can carry, food, ammunition, blankets." He tore a strip from a clean sheet and quickly bandaged his own bleeding forearm. It was a shallow cut, already clotting, but it stung like fire. Seda was already moving, pulling Onawa up, whose face was pale and slick with a feverish sweat. "Where do we go, the horses?" "2 mounts," Asher said, grabbing his Spencer and the box of shells. "My horse, my mule. Onawa rides Dustwing. Kestrel takes the supplies. We walk, we go where they cannot follow on horseback." He led them out the back, not even glancing at the moaning slaver on the porch. They moved through the rain to the lean-to stable. The animals were nervous, smelling the gunpowder and blood. Asher saddled Dustwing and threw the pack saddle on Kestrel with practiced, frantic speed. He loaded the mule with the food, his medical roll, and every blanket he owned. "Help me," he said to Tiva. They lifted Onawa onto the tall gelding. She slumped in the saddle, barely conscious. "Up," he said to Chenoa and Tiva, pointing to the cliff face behind the cabin. "Not the trail. We climb." He led the way, pulling the horse and mule up a narrow game trail, little more than a goat track that snaked up the side of Stone Lantern Canyon. It was a path known only to him and the bighorn sheep. The rain was their ally now, washing away their tracks as soon as they were made, the roar of the wind muffling the sound of their escape. They moved for an hour in the relentless dark, a desperate climbing scramble. Asher led the horse, Seda walked beside him, and Chenoa and Tiva flanked the mule. The mud was ankle-deep, a slick, treacherous soup that tried to steal their boots with every step. Onawa began to moan, a low, delirious sound. Tiva, walking beside the horse, put her hand to her sister's forehead. "She is burning!" The girl's body was racked with violent shivers, the fever fighting the cold rain. Tiva made a decision. She ripped her own blanket from Kestrel's pack, heedless of the rain that had already soaked it. She draped the sodden, heavy wool over Onawa, cocooning her. Asher glanced back, questioning the move. "To break the heat," Tiva said, her voice sharp. "The wet draws it out. It is better than letting her cook from the inside." Asher nodded. It was hard medicine, but it was sound. They found a shallow overhang of sandstone, barely a cave, that offered a small respite from the direct assault of the wind. They huddled inside, the 5 of them and the 2 animals, a miserable, steaming knot of life. Asher checked Onawa. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse a panicked rabbit's beat. "The wound," he said. "The infection is setting in." Chenoa, her hawk eyes scanning the terrain even in the gloom, suddenly slipped out of the shelter. She ignored Asher's hissed command to stay. She moved to the south-facing slope of the canyon, her eyes on the ground. She returned 2 minutes later, her hands full of pale green, jointed stems. "Ephedra," she said, holding them out. "Mormon tea. It will sweat the fever." Asher looked at the risk. A fire, but he looked at Onawa, who was fading. He made his choice. He found a spot deep in the overhang, shielded by a curtain of rock. Using his flint and steel, and a handful of dried tinder he kept in a waterproof pouch, he coaxed a tiny, smokeless fire to life, feeding it dry twigs. The flame was no bigger than his hand. He filled his tin cup with water from his canteen and balanced it on 2 stones over the flame. He added the stems Chenoa had gathered. When it boiled, he cooled it, the bitter, medicinal scent filling their small shelter. He and Tiva lifted Onawa, forcing the hot, brown liquid past her lips. She gagged, but she swallowed. They rested for only 20 minutes, just long enough for the tea to take effect. They had to keep moving. The storm began to ease as they climbed higher, the rain diminishing to a steady, cold drizzle. This was bad. A light rain meant clear tracks. They crested Dry Needle Ridge, a high, exposed spine of rock that offered a panoramic view of the basin below. Chenoa, scouting 30 yards ahead, suddenly dropped, signaling flat-handed for them to stop. Asher crawled up beside her. He followed her pointed finger. A mile below, nestled in a box canyon, was another fire. A large one. A camp. "That is not Pike," Asher whispered, his eye tracing the perimeter. "I see 7 men, 10 horses. That's a depot camp. Drummond's men." Seda breathed from behind him. "Waiting for Pike to bring us in." They were trapped. The main pursuit was behind them, and a fresh picket was in front of them, blocking the only way down. The ridge was exposed, a clear silhouette against the lightening sky. The sentry at the camp below stirred, stretching. Seda moved. She picked up a handful of small, sharp pebbles. She crept to the far edge of the ridge, away from their group. She gauged the distance, the wind. Then, with a strong underhand flick, she tossed a single stone far to their left, down a steep scree slope. The clatter of the rock, falling 100 feet, was sharp in the damp air. "What was that?" the sentry below shouted, grabbing his rifle. He and another man moved away from their fire, walking toward the noise. "Now," Seda whispered. Asher nodded, a deep, new respect for her in his eyes. He led the animals and the women, one by one, across the exposed spine of rock, keeping to the reverse slope, while the sentries were distracted by a ghost. They descended into a deep arroyo on the other side, but the relief was short-lived. Onawa cried out, a sharp, clear sound of pain. Asher stopped, holding up a hand. He looked at her arm. The bandage he had tied in the cabin was black with fresh blood. The scramble had torn the stitches. "We have to stop it," he said, his voice grim. "She's bleeding out." He found another small shelter, this one a washout under the roots of a massive, upended cottonwood. "Tiva, hold her. Chenoa, watch our back trail. Seda, the fire kit." They worked as a team. Asher laid out his medical roll. He saw the problem. The gash was too long, the skin too torn. The simple stitches had not held. "This is the only way," he said. He took his suture needle from the kit. Seda, understanding, already had the tiny fire going. Asher held the needle in the flame until it glowed a dull, sterile red. "I am sorry, Onawa," he whispered. He poured the last drops of the Mormon tea onto the wound to clean it, then took the hot needle. Tiva held Onawa in a grip of iron, her own face a mask of agony, whispering in her sister's ear. Asher did not cauterize. He stitched. He passed the needle through the skin, pulling the two flaps of the gash together, the heat of the needle searing the flesh just enough to stop the weeping blood as he tied each knot. His movements were precise, economical, and brutal. He did not look at the girl's face. He focused only on the task, on the closure. When he was done, he had laid a neat, if angry, row of 8 new stitches. He bandaged it tightly, using his own neckerchief as a pressure pad. Onawa had mercifully passed out. They pushed on, following the arroyo as it widened. The ground here was a treacherous, sucking bog. The rain had turned the dry wash into a river of thick, gray mud. Kestrel, the mule, suddenly went down. It plunged a foreleg deep into a pocket of quick mud, braying in terror. The animal thrashed, sinking itself deeper, the precious pack of supplies tilting dangerously. "Hold!" Asher roared. "He panics! He's lost!" He grabbed his lariat from Dustwing's saddle. He waded into the mud, which sucked at his own thighs, ignoring the cold. He looped the rope around the mule's neck and chest, working frantically. "Seda mount Dustwing. Tiva, Chenoa, grab the rope. Pull when I say." Seda, covered in mud, hauled herself onto the saddle. Asher and the other 2 sisters dug their heels into the bank, taking the strain. "Now!" Asher yelled. Seda spurred the powerful buckskin, making him rear and pull. The sisters hauled, their muscles straining. Asher pushed the mule from behind, trying to break the suction. For a terrible second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a giant cork pulling free, Kestrel lunged forward, scrambling onto solid ground, shaking, covered in black, stinking mud. Asher fell back, panting, soaked to the bone. He checked the pack. It was secure. "He's all right," he gasped, wiping mud from his face. "We are all right." He was not just saving a mule. He was saving their food, their ammunition. He was saving their speed. They climbed out of the lowlands, reaching the head of the trail just as the first, sick, gray light of dawn broke. Asher stopped, studying the landscape. "The fast trail south goes by Fort Calhoun Spur," he said, thinking aloud. "Pike will have men there, or Drummond will. They'll have a telegraph. The whole territory will be hunting us by noon." The juniper cut off, Chenoa said, pointing west. It was a faint trail leading into the foothills. "It goes around the mountain. It is longer. 2 days' walk." "We take it," Asher said without hesitation. "Longer is safer." As they started on the new path, a low, haunting sound echoed through the valleys. A train whistle. Seda stopped, her head coming up. The Copperjack Mine. They all looked. Far below, a train, its headlamp still burning in the gloom, was snaking its way south. It was a long line of flatbeds and locked cattle cars. "A freight train," Asher murmured. His eyes narrowed. "Headed for the border." "He ships guns on those trains," Seda said, her voice hard. "And he ships people. That is where they were taking us." Asher stared at the train, the mine, the railroad, the slavers. Drummond did not just own a piece of the territory. He owned the entire chain of corruption. This was not a gang of thugs. It was an enterprise. The sun was fully up by the time they descended into Ponderosa Hollow. They were on the edge of collapse, moving like ghosts, caked in mud. Onawa was conscious, but just barely. The hollow was a small, green miracle in the high desert. Centered around a natural spring, a single, neat building stood there, built of sod and river stone, with a whitewashed front and a small garden. A simple, hand-painted cross was on the door. "Mennonites," Asher breathed, relief washing over him. "They are neutral. They help everyone." As if summoned, the door opened. A woman in a plain gray dress and a white bonnet stepped out. She was not old, but her face was stern and weathered, her arms thick with muscle from work. She saw the 5 of them, a nightmare of mud and blood and exhaustion. She saw the Apache sisters, the unconscious girl, the hard-bitten white man with a rifle in his hand and a bloody bandage on his arm. Her eyes widened, but she showed no fear. "God's peace be upon you," she said, her voice a firm, low German accent. Asher was too tired to be formal. He slid off Dustwing. "Ma'am, we mean no harm, but this girl, she is dying. She has a fever, a bad wound. She needs a clean bed. She needs help." The woman, Elspeth Klein, stepped forward. She looked past Asher, past the rifles. She looked directly at Onawa. She put a practical hand on the girl's forehead. "She burns," Elspeth stated. She looked at Tiva, at Seda. Then, her piercing blue eyes met Asher's. "The men who did this," she said. Not a question, but a demand. "Are they coming for her?" Asher looked back up the trail they had just taken. He knew Pike. He knew his kind. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They are." Elspeth Klein stood aside, holding the door to her small, clean clinic open. "Then bring her inside," she said, her voice like iron. "I will tend to the child, but I am a nurse. I am not a fortress. I cannot stop them when they arrive." "You won't have to," Asher said, helping Tiva lift Onawa from the horse. "You just keep her alive. We will provide the protection." Elspeth Klein's clinic was an island of stark, antiseptic order. While the storm had abated, the world outside remained a watercolor of gray mud and weeping skies. Inside, the air smelled of carbolic soap, lye, and brewing herbs. Elspeth had laid Onawa on her own narrow cot, the girl's feverish breathing the only sound in the room. A rhythmic, painful rasp. Asher, Seda, Tiva, and Chenoa sat at Elspeth's small table, drinking hot, bitter broth. The warmth was life, but it did not touch the cold that had settled in their bones. Asher was watching Elspeth work. She was efficient, her hands gentle but firm, sponging Onawa's face, checking the angry, stitched wound. "You have seen this before," Asher stated. It was not a question. Elspeth did not look up. "I have seen many things, Mr. Vale, sickness, accidents, greed." "The slavers," Asher pressed, his voice low. "Pike, Drummond." "How often?" Elspeth finally paused. She wrung out the cloth and placed it on Onawa's forehead. She turned, her blue eyes piercing. "The railroad is a great beast, Mr. Vale. It eats land, and it eats people. Mr. Drummond does not call it slavery. He calls it progress. He calls it labor acquisition." She walked to a tall, locked cabinet against the wall. She produced a key from her apron and opened it. It was not filled with medicine, but with ledgers. She pulled one out, a thick, bound book, and placed it on the table with a heavy, final sound. "I am a Mennonite. We are neutral. We do not take sides in men's wars," she said, her voice tight with a suppressed anger that belied her words. "But I am also a nurse, and I must keep records. The railroad." "They insist on records." She opened the book. It was a vaccination ledger. "Mr. Drummond is a very modern man. He does not want his property dying of smallpox or cholera before it reaches its destination. He pays me to vaccinate them." She ran a thick finger down a list of names. "See here, Copperjack Mine payroll, pending transfer. And here, railroad labor. They bring them in groups of 10, sometimes 20. Always women, always Apache, or Pima, or Paiute." Asher leaned closer, his eyes scanning the neat, spidery script beside each group of names. In the margin, Elspeth had made a small, two-part notation. SD, MX. Seda saw it at the same time. Her breath caught. "Silas Drummond," she whispered, her voice a blade. "Mexico." "I asked about the mark," Elspeth said, her face grim. "The foreman, a man named Tolliver, told me it was an accounting code, shipping designation. He called it—" Asher's mind flashed to the train he had seen in the pre-dawn gloom, the locked cattle cars, the high-sided freight cars, the Copperjack Mine. Asher thought aloud, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. "The railroad, the slavers, it is all one machine." He stood up, unable to sit, and began to pace the small clinic floor. "Pike is just the dog catcher. Drummond is the master. And he is not just a brute. He is an industrialist." He stopped, looking at Seda. "This territory is run by three things: the army, the railroad, and the law. And Drummond already owns the railroad. That means he owns the law that runs alongside it." "The town," Tiva said, her voice a low growl. "Coyote's Gate." "Exactly," Asher said. "Who is the district judge in Coyote's Gate? Lindsley. Lindsley got his seat because Drummond's money campaigned for him. And who is Marshal Cobb Lindsley's man? We cannot go to the law. The law is his. We are just escaped property to them." A new, desperate silence settled on the room. They were not just hunted by a gang. They were fugitives from the entire system. "The train," Seda said, her eyes fixed on the ledger. "The one we saw this morning. It will run again." Asher nodded, his face granite. "It is the main supply line. It runs every night, the 7 o'clock freight. It passes through Mesquite Pass. They will not stop because of Pike's failure. They will just load another shipment." Seda's hand went to the small, oilskin pouch at her belt. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers stiff. She pulled out the tarnished brass tag she had ripped from Drummond's coat. S.D. She held it out. "He was there, at Mescal Wash. He watched Pike round us up. He was wearing an expensive coat. And this was on it." Asher took the tag. He held it in his palm. He looked at the logo stamped on the cover of Elspeth's ledger. It was the official insignia of the Silas Drummond Railroad Mining Company. The initials were identical. The font, the sharp, proprietary serifs. It was a perfect match. "This," Asher said, holding the tag, "puts him there. This is our proof." "Proof," Chenoa scoffed, her first words in an hour. "Proof for who the marshal you said he owns." "No," Asher said. A new, dangerous light was in his eye. The mind of the former scout, the man who read maps and planned routes, was now seeing a different kind of battlefield. Not for him, for someone he cannot buy. He looked at Elspeth. "There is a rumor. A federal judge, Ada Whitlock. She is in the territory. They say she is inspecting the railroad grants." Elspeth nodded, a small, grim smile touching her lips for the first time. "She is, and she is not a rumor. She is scheduled to arrive in Coyote's Gate tomorrow morning. On the 9 o'clock passenger train, Mr. Drummond is planning a very large, very official welcome for her. He is concerned." "A federal judge," Asher said. The plan forming, desperate and sharp. "She has federal authority. She overrides Lindsley. She overrides Cobb, if we can get this to her. She will need more than a tag and a vaccination book," Seda said, her mind moving with his. "She will need his accounts." She looked at Asher. "Pike had a book, but the real one. The one that matters. I saw it when they took me to the depot office at Copperjack to be processed. The accountant, a small man in a clean suit." "Mr. Tolliver," Elspeth supplied. "The chief accountant. He runs the depot at Coyote's Gate. He had a ledger." Seda continued, her voice intense. "It was indigo, bound in dark blue leather. He wrote down our names. He wrote down the money. I saw him lock it in a safe. The depot at Coyote's Gate." Asher said, "That is where the 7 o'clock train leaves. That is where Tolliver keeps his book. That is the nexus." He stopped pacing. He looked at the sisters. "Pike thinks we are running south," he said. "He thinks we are rabbits, but we are not. We are going to Coyote's Gate." Chenoa's eyes lit up, the hawk seeing the prey. "A raid." "A theft," Asher corrected. "We have until tomorrow morning. We get into that depot tonight. We get that indigo ledger from Tolliver's safe, and we get it into the hands of Judge Ada Whitlock." The plan was insane. It was suicide, but it was the only move they had. "We will need a new plan," Asher said, his voice dropping into the familiar cadence of a field briefing. "Chenoa, you are the fastest. You scout the town, the depot, Tolliver's office. How many guards, where the safe is, what the locks look like." Chenoa nodded, already pulling her damp cloak around her. She was a shadow, and she slipped out of the clinic door without a sound. "Tiva," Asher continued, "your lariat. The depot has a wood pile and a loading dock. I want you there, in the shadows. No one follows us out, no one." Tiva checked the coil of her rope, her face set. "Seda," Asher said, "we need supplies. My arm, Onawa's. We need clean bandages. Antiseptic. And," he paused, "ink. A bottle of ink. If we get that ledger, we need to be able to mark it, prove we had it, if they try to take it back." "The apothecary," Elspeth said. "Mr. Ouyang Shin. He runs the shop by the livery. He is Chinese. The railroad men treat him poorly. He has no love for Drummond. He may trade for herbs." Seda nodded, taking the small pouch of herbs Elspeth offered. "What about you?" Seda asked Asher. "I need an escape route," Asher said. "Gideon Brandt. He runs the only freight wagon line left in this territory. The railroad is choking him out of business. He hates Drummond more than any of us. He is moving a final shipment of hides tonight, trying to beat the railroad tariffs. I will offer him protection for that shipment, in exchange for a fast wagon waiting in the arroyo behind the depot at 8 o'clock. He turned. He had given his orders. The women were already preparing to move. A small, piteous sound came from the cot. Onawa. She was tossing in the fever, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clutching the blankets. She was dreaming. She was back with her captors. She spoke, not in her own tongue, but in the broken, terrified English they had forced on her. "No, no, Dark. Please." Her voice was a child's whisper, cracking with terror. "Don't let me go back to the dark car. Please, no, don't let me go back." The words struck the small group silent. Tiva went to her sister, holding her hand, murmuring to her. Asher closed his eyes. The ghost of his son, Eli, sick and helpless in that Kansas shack, rose before him. The crushing weight of his failure at Pinyon Flats, the smoke he had ridden away from, settled in his chest. He opened his eyes. The guilt was gone. The hesitation was gone. There was only a cold, hard, unyielding resolve. This was the same fight, but this time, he was not leaving. He looked at Seda, his face a mask of iron. "We get that book," he said, his voice a low promise. "We stop that train. No one is going back to the dark car, not ever again." When Chenoa and Seda returned hours later, as the gray afternoon began to fade toward a blood-red dusk, the plan was set. Chenoa had a map of the depot scratched on a piece of bark. Seda had a small bottle of carbolic acid and a jar of black ink. Asher had made his deal with Gideon Brandt. They stood in the clinic, the five of them. A strange, desperate alliance. Seda drew her skinning knife. Tiva drew hers. Chenoa, hers. Asher pulled his heavy bowie. Seda, her face illuminated by the single lamp, turned the handle of her knife. With the tip of her blade, she carefully carved 4 small, parallel horizontal lines into the worn wood. The sisters. She looked at Asher. Then, with a steady hand, she carved 1 strong, vertical line, intersecting the 4. Asher, the man who had not turned them away, the line that bound them. She passed the knife to Tiva, who looked at the sigil, then carved the same mark into her own knife. Chenoa did the same. Finally, Tiva took Asher's heavy bowie knife. She found a clear spot on the horn handle. She pressed the tip of her blade in, duplicating the mark, 4 lines and 1. A pact, a promise made not in words, but in wood and steel. Seda looked at Asher, her black eyes reflecting the lamplight. "We are not stock," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We are not cargo. We are this." She tapped the mark on her knife. "We live or we die. Together." Asher gripped the newly carved handle of his knife, the sharp edges of the cuts biting into his palm. He nodded. "Once. Together." Night fell on Coyote's gate like a hammer. This was not the clean, silent dark of the mesa, but a nervous, industrial gloom, cut by the harsh white glare of carbide gas lamps. The depot was a fortress of noise and steam, hissing and clanging as the 7 o'clock freight was prepared. The 5 of them moved not as people, but as currents of shadow between the hulking shapes of freight cars. Asher wore a heavy, greasy brakeman's jacket he had lifted from a peg. The cap pulled low, obscuring his face. Seda was wrapped in Elspeth Klein's long, severe gray coat, its shapelessness making her anonymous. But they were not a group of 5. Chenoa had already vanished. She had moved with a frightening liquid speed, scaling a rain gutter and disappearing onto the black, tarred roof of the main warehouse. She was their eyes. Tiva was their ghost. She slipped along the track bed, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. In her hands, she cupped small, damp bundles of sand. Chenoa's afternoon reconnaissance had been perfect. Tiva knew which lamps mattered. She stopped, 50 yards from the main office. She took a breath, measured the distance, and threw. The wet sand hit the hot glass mantle of the first lamp. There was a sharp, wet hiss, a pop, and the light died. A pool of shadow instantly flooded the track. She moved. 20 yards. She threw again. Pop! A second lamp died. She was creating a corridor of perfect darkness, a blind spot leading directly from the edge of the rail yard to the depot office door. "Now," Asher murmured. He and Seda moved, using the new darkness. They crossed the open ground and pressed into the shadows of the depot building, right beneath the clicking, frantic telegraph office. "Stay here. Wait for my signal." Seda nodded, her face pale but resolute in the gloom. She pressed back against the brickwork. Just one more shadow among many. Asher straightened up. adopting the weary, defeated slump of a railroad employee at the end of a long shift. He grabbed an empty, heavy mail sack from a hook by the door and slung it over his shoulder. He pushed his way into the office. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the smell of hot metal, and the frantic energy of men racing a clock. Clerks yelled manifests. A telegraph key chattered in the corner. And through the far window, Mr. Tolliver, the chief accountant, sat at his desk, bathed in the green light of his own desk lamp. He was exactly as Seda had described, small, fastidious, his clean suit a mark of arrogance in the surrounding grime. The safe, a large black iron box, was visible behind him. Asher walked toward the desk, his boots heavy on the floor. "Manifest for car 22, Mr. Tolliver," Asher mumbled, keeping his head down. Tolliver did not look up, his pen scratching furiously. "On the pile, you fool! Can you not see I am balancing the night ledger?" "Right, sir," Asher said. He made his move. He tripped over a loose floorboard, lurching forward, and let the heavy mailbag crash to the floor at Tolliver's feet. A small bundle of tied letters spilled out. "Clumsy oaf!" Tolliver shrieked, jumping back as the dirty canvas bag hit his polished shoes. "My figures, you have made me lose my place." "Terrible sorry, sir," Asher grunted, bending down on one knee to gather the letters, his body deliberately shielding his actions from the rest of the room. As he fumbled with the mail, he palmed a single 3-cent stamp he had brought from Elspeth's desk. "Oh, heavens," Asher said, his voice full of false concern. "Sir, in the spill, you dropped a stamp." "A 3-cent stamp?" Tolliver's eyes, magnified by his spectacles, snapped from his ledger to Asher's hand. He hated waste. A 3-cent stamp was 3 cents. "Idiot! Give it here. Do not just let it lie there." Tolliver leaned forward, annoyed, his right hand outstretched. It was the only opening Asher needed. Asher's left hand came up, holding the stamp, drawing Tolliver's focus. As Tolliver reached for it, Asher's right hand, a hardened, calloused vice, shot out from under the mailbag. He did not grab the hand. He grabbed the wrist. He turned it, sharply, inward and down. There was no sound, only the faint, sickening pop of small bones. Tolliver's eyes flew wide. His mouth opened in a perfect O of a scream, but no sound came out. The sheer, blinding agony paralyzed his lungs. His body went rigid, his face instantly white and slick with sweat. Asher leaned in, his face inches from the accountant's, his voice a venomous whisper. "The key, the one in your vest, or I break the other one." Slowly. Tears of pure agony streamed from Tolliver's eyes. He gave a spastic, frantic nod. Asher, still shielding his movements with the mailbag, slid his hand into Tolliver's vest, retrieved the heavy iron key, and pocketed it. "You will sit here," Asher breathed, "and you will not move until I am gone. You will not make a sound. If you do, I will come back, and I will finish you." He stood up, slinging the mailbag over his shoulder. "Got it, sir. Sorry for the trouble." He walked out of the office. No one had seen a thing. He bypassed Seda, moving directly to the locked records room where Chenoa had reported the safe was kept. The key slid into the lock. It turned smoothly. He was inside. He shut the door, lit a match. There it was, the safe. The key fit its lock as well. The heavy tumblers clicked. The door swung open with a well-oiled sigh. And there it was, just as she had said, a thick, heavy ledger, bound in dark indigo leather. Asher pulled it out. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it, lit another. He opened the book. His heart stopped. It was all there, page after page, lists of names, all women, all Apache, dates, numbers, SDMX, 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 prices, bounties paid, shipments confirmed, and on the final summary page, dated today. A spidery, elegant, and damning signature, Silas Drummond. It was the golden proof. Asher tucked the book into his heavy jacket, his mind racing. He stepped out of the room, locking it behind him. He started to walk toward the exit, and froze. A shout from the rail yard, sharp and clear. "Riders coming! It is Mr. Pike! Open the main gate!" Pike, he was early. He was not supposed to be here for another hour. A guard, eager to show his diligence, ran to the main signal post and yanked the heavy cord for the alarm bell. A deafening clang, clang, clang erupted, shattering the night. It was not a fire alarm, but a signal of a high-priority arrival. It called every available man to the main platform. Asher was trapped. Pike and his men were riding in, and every guard in the depot was now running toward him. High above, on the warehouse roof, Chenoa saw it all. She saw Pike in the torchlight. She saw Asher, pinned in the doorway of the office. She saw the guards converging. She could not shoot Pike. The muzzle flash would give her away and seal their fate. She needed a diversion, a massive one. Her eyes scanned the yard. She saw the steam engine for the 7 o'clock train, hissing, building pressure. And she saw the complex web of ropes and pulleys leading from the control tower to the main yard whistle. She sighted down the barrel of her carbine. The target was small, a brass valve junction 60 yards away. She fired. The crack of the rifle was lost in the clang of the bell and the hiss of the engine. The bullet struck true. It shattered the valve assembly. The result was instantaneous. A deafening, continuous shriek ripped the air apart. The whistle was stuck open. It was not a signal. It was a solid wall of sound. An agonizing, deafening blast that drowned out every other noise. Men clapped their hands over their ears. Horses reared. "The valve!" a foreman screamed, though no one could hear him. "It is a mechanical failure." "Shut the main boiler! Shut it down!" Pike was yelling, his face purple, but his words were completely erased by the shriek. The yard dissolved into pure chaos. "Now!" Asher roared. He grabbed Seda, pulling her from her hiding spot. "The chute go." He pointed to the coal chute Chenoa had marked. They ran, shielded by the noise. They reached the chute just as Chenoa dropped from the roof, landing silently on the coal pile below. Asher pushed Seda in. "Slide!" She vanished into the darkness. Asher followed, sliding down the slick metal, landing hard in the mountain of coal dust at the bottom. Tiva was there, her knife drawn. "2 guards, coming around the back, drawn by the whistle." 2 dark figures rounded the corner, rifles ready. Tiva did not wait. She threw the small clay pot Ouyang Shin had given her. It smashed on the gravel at their feet. It did not explode. It erupted. A dense, choking cloud of yellow smoke, ground peppers, sulfur, and saltpeter billowed outward. The men did not shout. They simply collapsed, dropping their rifles, their hands clawing at their throats as they gasped and choked, blinded and suffocated by the acrid fumes. "The book!" Asher yelled, pulling the indigo ledger from his jacket. Seda was ready. She had the heavy, oiled waxcloth sheet open. She slapped the ledger into it, folded the cloth tight, and tied the entire bundle flat against her stomach with rawhide strips. Beneath the long gray coat, it was secure. "The wagon," Asher pointed. "The arroyo. Run!" The only thing between them and freedom was the dark, cavernous parcel dispatch room. Asher kicked the door open and shoved the sisters inside, and ran straight into Vaughn Pike. He was not at the platform. He had not been fooled by the whistle. He had cut through the building, anticipating their escape route. He was alone, and he was smiling. "Property," he snarled, and he lunged. Not at Asher. At Seda. Asher moved like lightning. He threw himself between them, shoving Seda backward. "Run," Pike's knife, a long, thin Arkansas toothpick, flashed in the gloom. Asher barely had time to draw his own bowie. The blades met with a sharp, high-pitched shing. This was not a duel. It was a brawl. Pike was fast, a vicious brawler. He stabbed, he slashed, he kicked. Asher was on the defensive, all his strength and skill focused on one thing: blocking, keeping Pike from getting past him to Seda. Pike feinted low, then snapped the blade up toward Asher's face. Asher twisted, but the needle-sharp tip raked across his cheek. A thin, hot line of fire opened from the corner of his eye to the line of his jaw. The blow knocked Asher off balance. Pike lunged, driving Asher back against a tall sorting shelf. They locked up, wrist against wrist, grunting, their faces inches apart. The air was hot with the smell of their sweat and the metallic tang of blood. They stared into each other's eyes. The civilized world was gone. The depot, the train, the law, all gone. There was only this. The feud had a name. "Asher, the wagon is here," Seda screamed from the far door. The distraction was all Asher needed. He broke the deadlock, not with finesse, but with raw power. He slammed his forehead into Pike's nose. There was a wet crunch. Pike roared in pain, staggering back, his hand flying to his broken face. Asher did not press the attack. He grabbed Seda's arm. "Go!" They burst out the back door and tumbled down the short embankment into the dry arroyo. Gideon Brandt was there, his 6-horse team already stamping, terrified by the depot whistle. Get in by the gods! Vale, you are late." Cheno and Tiva were already in the back of the heavy freight wagon, pulling the hay bales over themselves. Asher threw Seda over the tailgate, then scrambled in after her, landing on the rough-hewn planks. Pike appeared in the doorway above them, blood streaming from his ruined nose. He raised his revolver, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "Yeah!" Gideon cracked his whip. The massive wagon lurched, wheels screaming, and then bolted, crashing into the darkness of the arroyo. Pike fired. The bullet splintered the wood of the tailgate, inches from Asher's head. Pike stood there in the doorway, watching them vanish. He did not chase them. He calmly wiped the blood from his mouth. He turned back into the chaotic depot, the steam whistle still screaming. "Find my horse," he snarled to a terrified-looking guard. "And get a telegrapher. Send a message to Mr. Drummond. Tell him the scout and the girl have the indigo book. And tell him I will bring him Vale's head on a platter. I swear it." Dawn broke over Coyote's gate, not with hope, but with a dry, suffocating heat. The town, usually a hive of railroad activity, was unnaturally quiet. Word had spread the 9 o'clock train was bringing Judge Ada Whitlock. The impromptu courtroom was the grand lobby of the Grand Western Hotel. It was a space Silas Drummond had built to impress investors, marble floors, high ceilings, chandeliers that dripped crystal. Now, it was a battleground. Judge Ada Whitlock sat behind a heavy oak table that had been dragged into the center of the room. She was a small woman in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, iron-gray bun. But her eyes, behind thin, wire-rimmed spectacles, were sharp and unyielding as polished agate. "State your business," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd miners, merchants, and railroad men, all watching. Asher stepped forward. He was still wearing the filthy brakeman's jacket, the blood dried black on his cheek where Pike had cut him. He placed the indigo ledger on the table. "I bring evidence, Your Honor, of a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of legitimate commerce, human trafficking, kidnapping, slavery." A gasp rippled through the room. Marshal Cobb, a large man with a red face and a tin star that looked too shiny to be real, stepped forward, his hand on his gun belt. "Now see here, Judge." Cobb boomed. "This man is a fugitive. Wanted for assault at the depot last night. That book is stolen property of the Drummond Company. I am confiscating it." He reached for the ledger. Judge Whitlock's hand slammed down on the book, flat and hard. The sound was like a gavel strike. "You will do no such thing, Marshal," she said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute, terrifying authority. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a heavy, silver badge and eagle with spread wings. She placed it on the table next to the ledger. "I am a federal circuit judge. My jurisdiction supersedes yours in all matters crossing territorial lines. This is now a federal hearing. Anyone interfering will be held in contempt and jailed. Is that clear, Marshal?" Cobb froze. He looked at the badge. He looked at the crowd. Seeing his own authority evaporate in an instant, he stepped back, his face a mottled purple. "Proceed, Mr. Vale," Whitlock said. Asher nodded to Elspeth Klein. The sturdy nurse stepped forward, placing her own vaccination book next to the indigo ledger. "I am Elspeth Klein, registered nurse. I have vaccinated over 200 women in the last year at the request of Mr. Drummond's foreman, all listed as labor, all designated for Mexico. Then, Mr. Ouyang Shin, the apothecary, a quiet, dignified man in a silk tunic, stepped up. He placed a small jar of strange-smelling salve on the table. "I treat the women," he said softly. "For the burns, the brands. They use cattle irons. Sometimes I cannot save them." The silence in the lobby was absolute now. "And the victims?" Whitlock asked. Seda stepped forward. She wore no borrowed coat now. She stood tall in her own torn, mud-stained clothes, a warrior facing a tribunal. She did not shout. She did not weep. She spoke with a cold, clear precision that was more devastating than any scream. "They took us at Mescal Wash, Vaughn Pike and his men. They put us in cattle cars, dark cars, no water, no light. They told us we were sold to the haciendas in Sonora. They said Mr. Drummond had already spent the money." She looked directly at Whitlock. "They are not just selling labor, Judge. They are selling lives. They are selling them to the mines, to the railroad camps, and to the brothels across the border." It was the truth. Naked and ugly, laid bare in Drummond's own gilded lobby. Suddenly, the massive glass front doors of the hotel shattered inward with a deafening crash. Vaughn Pike stood there, a sawed-off shotgun in one hand, his revolver in the other. His nose was a grotesque purple ruin under a bloody bandage. "That book is mine," he roared, leveling the shotgun at the table. Chaos erupted. Men dove behind velvet sofas. Women screamed. Asher didn't think. He moved. He tackled Judge Whitlock, driving her to the marble floor behind the heavy oak table just as Pike fired. The shotgun blast roared like a cannon in the enclosed space. Buckshot tore through the air where Whitlock had been sitting a second before. A massive crystal chandelier above them shattered, raining razor-sharp shards of glass down on them. Asher felt a stinging bite in his shoulder as a piece of crystal embedded itself in his flesh. But he kept Whitlock covered. Pike charged into the room, eyes wild, heading straight for the ledger still on the table. He never made it. Tiva, who had been standing by a decorative marble pillar, moved. Her lariat, coiled and ready, snapped out. The loop caught Pike's wrist, the one holding the revolver. She yanked with all her strength. The gun flew from his hand, skittering across the floor. Chenoa, perched on the mezzanine balcony above, vaulted over the railing. She landed cat-like on a sofa, then sprang at Pike, swinging a heavy brass lamp she had grabbed. It connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud, spinning him around. Pike staggered, roaring in pain and rage, still gripping the empty shotgun. He raised it like a club, turning on Chenoa. "Now, Onawa!" Seda screamed. Onawa, the youngest, the wounded one, stepped out from behind the reception desk. She held the heavy glass inkwell from the hotel registry. She did not hesitate. She threw it with all the strength she had left. The heavy glass globe struck Pike square in the face, shattering on impact. Black, indelible ink exploded over him, covering his bandaged nose, his eyes, his clothes. He was instantly blinded. A thrashing, roaring monster painted in the color of his own guilt. "Marked," Seda shouted, her voice ringing over the din. "Marked for all to see." Pike, blinded and battered, stumbled backward, tripping over a sprawling chair and crashing out through the ruined doors into the street, where his men dragged him away. Silence returned to the lobby, broken only by the tinkling of falling glass. Judge Whitlock pushed Asher off her and stood up. She brushed glass shards from her severe black dress. She was bleeding from a small cut on her cheek, but her composure was terrifying. She walked back to the table. She picked up the indigo ledger, miraculously unharmed. She looked at Marshal Cobb, who was cowering behind a potted palm. "Marshal," she said, her voice like ice. "You have a pen." Cobb, shaking, handed her his fountain pen. She pulled a sheet of hotel stationery toward her and wrote furiously for a minute. She signed it with a savage slash of ink. "This is a federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Silas Drummond on charges of kidnapping, slavery, and attempted murder of a federal officer. I am also issuing an order sealing the Copperjack mine and the entire depot until a full investigation is complete. She turned to Asher. Mr. Vale, raise your right hand. Asher, still bleeding from the glass in his shoulder, did so. I am hereby deputizing you as a special federal marshal. Temporary status. Your sole duty is to transport these witnesses and this ledger safely to the district court in Prescott. Do you accept? I do, Asher said. Good, because Drummond will not let this stand. He will send everything he has to stop you before you reach Prescott. She was right. As they left the hotel, a breathless telegraph operator ran up to Asher. Sir, a message. Intercepted on the company line. From Drummond to the mine foreman. Stop them at Mesquite Pass. Use the 12. No survivors. The 12. Drummond's personal enforcers. Hard men, better armed and better mounted than Pike's thugs. Mesquite Pass is the only way west to Prescott, Asher said, his mind racing. It's a perfect ambush point, a narrow canyon, high walls. They will be waiting. He looked at Seda. They needed a plan that was not just brave, but cunning. We split up, Seda said, anticipating him. A decoy. Yes, Asher agreed. Gideon's wagon. We send it loud and fast toward Saguaro Divide. Make them think we are trying to flank them to the north. It will draw off half their men, maybe more. And us, Chenoa asked. We take the high trails. Asher said. Horseback, straight through the pass, but right under their noses, while they are watching the dust from the wagon to the north. It was a desperate gamble. It relied on Drummond's arrogance, his belief that they would run scared rather than ride straight into the teeth of his trap. Tiva, Chenoa, Asher commanded. You ride with Gideon. You are the noise. You make them chase you. Can you do it? Chenoa smiled, a fierce, hawk-like grin. We will lead them on a chase they will never forget. Seda, Onawa, you are with me. We take Judge Whitlock and the ledger through the pass. They stood on the dusty street of Coyote's Gate, a broken team forged in fire. They had started as a lonely man and 4 desperate fugitives. Now, they were the law, as they prepared to mount up. Seda touched Asher's arm. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the 4 parallel lines carved into the horn handle of his knife. Together, they rode out, splitting into 2 groups, heading straight into the ultimate test of their vow. They rode hard for hours, splitting from Gideon's wagon, pushing their horses up the high, treacherous goat trails that led toward Mesquite Pass. The faint rumble of Gideon's decoy wagon, loaded with rattling chains and driven hard by Chenoa and Tiva, faded to the north. Asher led his small, vital group Seda, a healing but exhausted Onawa, and the iron-willed Judge Whitlock. Night found them at Silverwash, a high-altitude basin sheltered by pines. An abandoned logger's cabin, little more than a one-room shack, stood near the creek. It was a godsend. We rest here, Asher commanded, his voice low. 2 hours, no more. They will be waiting at the pass at dawn, and so will we. Inside, the cabin was damp and smelled of pine resin and old ashes. Judge Whitlock, a woman who had clearly spent more time in courtrooms than on the trail, sank onto a rough-hewn bench, her face pale but composed. Onawa immediately curled up by the cold hearth, falling into the deep sleep of the wounded. Asher built a small, fast fire, just enough to break the chill, not enough to send a column of smoke. The soft, lop-selling patter of rain began again. A gentle drum on the tin roof, muffling any sound. I will take the first watch, Asher said, moving to the single, grimy window. Seda nodded. Her eyes on the glass shard still lodged deep in his shoulder. The dried blood on his jacket was stiff. You are hurt. It is nothing, he said, too quickly. He tried to roll his shoulder, and a sharp, involuntary wince betrayed him. Seda stood. She went to Elspeth's medical pouch, which she now carried. She pulled out the bottle of carbolic and a clean strip of linen. Sit, she said. It was not a request. Asher looked from her to the sleeping judge, then back. He sat on a low stool by the fire. We cannot waste the supplies. An infection will waste you, she countered. She moved behind him and, with a practical, firm grip, tore the bloody fabric of his jacket and shirt away from the wound. "Hold the lamp." He held the oil lamp up, his arm unsteady. The wound was ugly, a deep, purple gash where the glass had buried itself. "It is still in there?" she murmured. "Leave it. We do not have time." "No." Her voice was final. She took his Bowie knife, the one bearing their carved pact, and held the tip in the fire's flame until it glowed. Asher braced himself. Her hands were incredibly steady. "Do not move," she whispered. With a surgeon's speed, she probed the wound and flicked the glass shard out. It landed on the stone hearth with a small tink. Asher hissed, his whole body tensing, his hand gripping his knee. Seda poured the carbolic acid directly into the open cut. Asher's hand flew up, his fingers trembling not from the pain, but from the shock of it, the raw, burning violation. He had been shot, cut, and broken, but this intimate, painful act of care was something his body had forgotten. Seda saw his hand shake. She stopped her work. She slowly placed her own warm, steady hand over his, pressing his trembling fingers flat against his thigh. "It is done," she said, her voice soft. He did not pull away. He just breathed, his head bowed. Her hand on his was an anchor. He turned his hand, his fingers lacing with hers, a desperate, silent grip. She did not move. She simply held him, her thumb rubbing a small, slow circle on the back of his hand. He looked up. Her face was inches from his, illuminated by the firelight and the lamp he still held. The smell of the rain, the smoke, and the sharp antiseptic was all around them. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. But beneath it, he saw the same strength that had met him on his porch, the same fire that had pulled the tag from Drummond's coat. He set the lamp down. The world shrank to the small, warm space between them. He raised his uninjured hand, the one that was not holding hers, and touched her face. His calloused, rough fingers gently traced the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second. It was a surrender. Not to him, but to the moment, a shared admission that they were both, for this 1 second, at the end of their strength. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She met him halfway. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperate, profound gratitude. It was slow and deep and searching. It was the kiss of two survivors who had seen the absolute worst of the land and of men, and had found, in each other, a single, solid point of trust. He shifted, turning to face her, and his other arm came around her, pulling her close. His grip was tight, as if he was afraid she might dissolve into the smoke. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, her hands clinging to the front of his torn jacket. They just held each other, two broken people fitting their pieces together in the firelight, breathing in time. He could feel the steady beat of her heart against his chest. He whispered, his voice thick, the words torn from a place he kept locked away. "When I saw Pike's knife, I was afraid." "You were not," she murmured against his skin. "I saw your eyes." "No," he insisted, pulling back just enough to look at her. The cut on his cheek from Pike's blade stung. "Not of him. I was afraid. I am afraid of losing someone else I have tried to protect." His gaze flickered to the shadows, to the memory of the pignon chest. "I am not good at it, at saving people." Seda's expression hardened, but with loyalty, not anger. She brought her hands up to frame his face, her palms warm against his beard. "You saved us," she said, her voice fierce. "When you opened your door, when you bled on your floor, you saved Onawa's life. You did not abandon us." She looked into his eyes, and he saw the truth of her next words. "I have not known a single day of safety since I was taken. Not one. I wake up, and my first thought is of running. My first thought is of the knife." She leaned her forehead against his. "My first thought is not of that. Tonight, here, with you, I feel safe." He closed his eyes, the simple, powerful admission washing over him. It was a greater gift than water, or fire. He kissed her again, and this time there was a raw, aching need in it, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death. It was a promise, a vow, a hunger for something more than just survival. It was deep and long, and left them both breathless. But it was not a fire that would consume them. It was a fire that would warm them. They were wounded. They were exhausted. And they had a war to fight in the morning. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of pure reverence. Get some sleep. Seda, your watch, she whispered. I will not sleep, he said. She looked at the empty cot, then at the floor by the fire. She took his uninjured hand and pulled him down, sitting with their backs against the rough-hewn log wall. She did not go to a separate bed. She settled beside him, pulling a thick wool blanket, one of his from Raven's Bluff, over both of them. She laid her head on his good shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, and their hands found each other, lacing together in the warmth between them. Judge Whitlock and Onawa slept on. The rain whispered on the roof, a curtain of sound that sealed them in. The firelight played over their faces, softening the hard lines of war and flight, leaving only the peaceful, rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing. The night closed in, a soft, quiet dark, holding them in a truce, their hearts beating in time. The first gray light of dawn woke them. They had not moved. They woke to the new, quiet reality. No grand promises had been made. None were needed. They simply looked at each other and nodded. It was time. Asher stood, his shoulders stiff but clean, and went outside to check the horses. A few minutes later, 2 riders emerged from the mist, Cheno and Tiva, their faces grim but alive. They had led the decoy chase all night and had circled back to the rendezvous. Chenoa dismounted, her hawk eyes taking in the scene. She saw Asher, and she saw Seda, who was wrapping a fresh bandage on Onawa's arm, and she saw the thick wool blanket, Seda's own, now draped over Asher's shoulders to ward off the pre-dawn chill. A slow, small smile touched Chenoa's lips, a rare sight. Tiva saw it and nudged Onawa, who was now sitting up and sipping water. Tiva put a finger to her lips, a silent, do not tease. The new bond was seen. It was accepted. Asher joined them, pulling a map from his saddlebag. The feeling from the night before did not soften him. It hardened him. It gave him focus. Chenoa, Tiva, report. We pulled them, Chenoa said. At least 8 of them. They are chasing Gideon's dust trail all the way to Saguaro Divide. They think we are all in that wagon. That leaves 4, Asher said. And Drummond, at the pass. He looked at Seda, and his gaze was steady. This is it, the affection we have just earned. It is a responsibility. It means we must get everyone to that court, alive, no matter the cost. They tightened their saddle girths, the quiet intimacy of the night replaced by the cold, hard steel of the morning. Mesquite Pass was a scar in the earth, a narrow slot of red rock and blowing dust. Drummond's remaining 4 men, the core of his 12, were dug in on the high ledges, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. Below them, on the canyon floor, Vaughn Pike sat on his horse, his ruined, ink-stained face a mask of pure malice. He was positioned on the left flank, guarding the narrowest point. The wind, a hot, scouring headwind, howled up the pass, stinging their eyes with grit. Asher reined in Dustwing at the mouth of the canyon. Judge Whitlock sat her horse beside him, her face grim. Onawa, Seda, Chenoa, and Tiva formed a tight half-circle around her. Gideon is in place, Asher said, his voice low and tight, just loud enough to cut through the wind. He unrolled his map. The plan had been born in the pre-dawn cold, a desperate pull-pull gambit. Gideon will be the first pull. He briefed them one last time, his finger tracing a line. He takes his hay wagon into the pass. He's bait. They'll fire on him, and that will show us their positions. Chenoa. The hawk-eyed sister nodded, her gaze already on the high rocks. You are the second pull. You go high, above their rifle nests. You become the threat they cannot ignore. He looked at Tiva. The pass bottlenecks at that rock fall. You are the wall. When they try to run, you block the exit. And us? Seda asked. She and Onawa had the judge between them. You are the steel. You guard the judge and the ledger with your lives. You do not move. You do not fire, unless I am down. I am going for Pike. Gideon Brant cracked his whip. Yeah, his heavy wagon, loaded with rattling, empty barrels and loose hay, rumbled into the pass. The first shot was a sharp crack from the rocks, followed by a puff of white smoke. A bullet splintered the wagon's side panel. There, Asher yelled. 2 men, high ridge, on the right. A second shot. From Pike's position on the left. That is all of them, Asher said. 4. And Drummond, somewhere safe, watching. As Gideon's wagon thundered forward, drawing their fire, Chenoa melted from her horse and began to climb the sheer eastern wall, moving like a lizard. Using cracks in the rock a goat would have refused. Tiva, now, Asher ordered. Tiva dismounted, her lariat in hand, and sprinted for a cluster of boulders, vanishing into the shadows. The first part of the plan had worked. The ambushers' positions were known. The battle became a terrible, deadly dance, played out in 3 dimensions. A rifleman on the right ridge, frustrated that his shots were being wasted on a hay wagon, saw the smaller, more important group with the judge. He broke cover, scrambling down for a better angle. Tiva was waiting. Her rope snapped out, a silent, 30-foot strike. The loop settled perfectly over the man's head and shoulders. She did not pull him from his feet. She simply braced herself and let his own momentum do the work. He was yanked from the ledge, crashing 10 feet to the rocks below, his rifle clattering away. At the same time, Gideon, having reached the end of his run, lit the fuse on Tiva's smoke pot in the back of his wagon. The hay, soaked in saltpeter and sulfur, did not burn. It erupted in a volcano of dense, choking, yellow smoke. The headwind that had been their enemy now became their greatest ally. Grabbing the massive cloud and hurling it back up the pass, directly into the faces of the remaining riflemen, the canyon was instantly filled with a blind, acrid fog. Asher! Chenoa's voice cried from high above. She had outflanked them. 2 men, trapped by the smoke. Asher didn't wait. He spurred Dustwing, charging through the yellow haze toward Pike's last known position. He found him on a narrow ledge, 20 feet up, choking and cursing in the smoke. Asher leapt from the saddle, drawing his bowie, and scrambled up the rocks. The fight was immediate, close, and brutal. This was not a gunfight. It was a brawl for survival on a 2-foot-wide shelf of rock. Pike, his face a grotesque map of ink and broken cartilage, roared, his own knife flashing. They locked up, the precipice inches from their heels. Pike was fueled by pure, psychotic rage. He was faster, more vicious, stabbing and slashing with no thought for his own defense. He was a cornered animal. He feinted with his shoulder, and as Asher adjusted, Pike's blade snaked out, slicing a deep, burning gash along Asher's ribs. Asher grunted, stumbling back, his boot heel slipping on the loose gravel. Pike smiled, his teeth black with ink. He raised his knife for the final, killing thrust. No! Seda was there. She had seen Asher fall. She had scrambled up the rock face after him, Elspeth Klein's heavy, iron-shod walking stick in her hand. She did not hesitate. She swung it with both hands. A desperate, horizontal arc. The heavy wood connected with Pike's wrist with a sound like a dry branch snapping. Pike screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The knife fell from his shattered hand, clattering into the void. Asher lunged. He slammed his shoulder into Pike's chest, driving him back against the rock wall, knocking the wind from his lungs. Asher grabbed Pike's good arm, twisted it behind him, and, in a single, practiced motion, took the leather thong from his own saddle and hog-tied the slaver, binding his wrists to his ankles. Pike was finished. A new sound echoed through the pass, the frantic click-clack of a railroad handcar. "He is running!" Tiva yelled from below. Silas Drummond, dressed in a fine suit, had emerged from a hidden railroad spur. Seeing his entire force defeated, he was pumping the handle of an inspection car. Fleeing back toward the depot, Onawa, who had been guarding the judge, watched him go. She saw the man who had ordered her capture, who had put her in the dark car. She looked at the light carbine Asher had given her. Her hands were shaking. She thought of the dark. She thought of her sisters. She raised the rifle. Her hands steadied. She did not aim for the man. She aimed for the machine. "The brake," she whispered, her voice clear. She fired. The ping of the bullet was sharp. It struck the cast-iron brake lever. The mechanism shattered. The car's wheels locked instantly, and the handcar bucked, throwing Silas Drummond headfirst into the gravel and ballast. Silence. The Battle of Mesquite Pass was over. The wind died down. The smoke began to clear. Into that silence came the steady, rhythmic sound of a dozen horses, moving at a canter. A troop of UAs, marshals, their blue uniforms and silver stars immaculate, rode into the pass. Judge Ada Whitlock stepped out from behind the boulder where Seda had hidden her. She holstered her small derringer. "Marshal," she called to the man in the lead. "You are just in time." She walked to the groaning, dazed Silas Drummond and picked up his fine silk hat from the dust. "Silas Drummond," she announced, her voice echoing in the sudden stillness. "You are under arrest for the enslavement of territorial citizens and the attempted murder of a federal judge." The marshal, his face like stone, cuffed Drummond, who was now weeping. His mask of power shattered. "You cannot," Drummond shrieked, his voice cracking. "I have friends in Washington. I have friends." Judge Whitlock stepped so close to him that he flinched. "The federal government is higher." "Mr. Drummond," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper that all could hear. "And it is higher than all your dirty hands." She then walked to the ledge where Asher was helping Seda down. She looked at the bound, moaning, ink-stained Vaughn Pike. "And this," she said, holding up the indigo ledger, "is the proof. The mark on his face matches the mark in this book." The gathered crowd miners, farmers, and Elspeth and Mr. Ouyang Shin, who had followed the marshals, let out a ragged cheer. Asher, bleeding from his ribs, his cheek, and his arm, walked to the center of the pass. He stood before the four sisters. Onawa stood tall, the carbine in her hand. Tiva and Chenoa, covered in dust and sweat, stood beside her. Seda, her face smudged with smoke, her eyes clear, stood last. Asher, the federal special marshal, in front of the judge and the community, did not give them orders. He bowed his head. "From this day forward," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of a man who had earned it in blood, "no man will ever call you cargo again. You are not property. You are the women who saved this valley." Elspeth and Mr. Ouyang stepped forward, standing with them. The miners and the freighters, men and women who had lived in fear of Drummond, moved, forming a wide, silent circle. It was not a crowd of onlookers. It was a community, reformed. It was a line drawn, a promise. The Prescott Circuit Court was not swift, but it was just. With the indigo ledger, the testimony of a federal judge, and the combined voices of Elspeth, Ouyang Shin, and Seda, the case was iron. Silas Drummond and Vaughn Pike were found guilty of forced servitude, kidnapping, and conspiracy to traffic human lives. Their sentences were long, hard years, shattering the iron grip Drummond had held on the territory. Judge Whitlock, true to her word, did not stop there. She signed a sweeping federal protection order for all the women rescued from Drummond's network, placing them under the direct care of the government, and not, as she put it, the whims of local prejudice. The verdict was more than a legal victory. It was a shift in the land itself. The fear that had lived like a low-grade fever in the territory finally broke. In Ponderosa Hollow, Elspeth Klein took the interim sign off her clinic door. With funds allocated by the federal court from Drummond's seized assets, she built the official Ponderosa Medical Station. Ouyang Shin, now a respected member of the new town council, managed its dispensary, his knowledge of herbs and Eastern medicine now working alongside Elspeth's carbolic and surgical steel. The two communities, once divided by fear, were now bound by mutual aid. Asher was summoned to Prescott by Judge Whitlock. His temporary marshal's badge was gone. In its place, she offered him a permanent one, engraved with a federal eagle. "The northern stretch, Mr. Vale," she said, her office smelling of law books and strong coffee. "It is a 100-mile-long nest of vipers. It needs a man who cannot be bought and will not break. It needs you." It was the life he had left. An order, a duty, a restoration of the honor he thought he had lost at Pinyon Flats. He rode back to Raven's Bluff, the badge heavy in his pocket. The cabin was just as he had left it, the door broken, the floor stained. He stood in the wreckage of his old life, the smell of gunpowder still faint in the stones. Seda was waiting for him at the spring, her horse packed. She had come to say goodbye. "You are a federal man now," she said, her voice flat, but her eyes held a different, deeper story. "You will go to Prescott or Washington. They offered me the northern stretch," he said. "A big, empty land." She replied, her gaze moving to the mountains. "My people are in the Black Alder Valley. The women who were freed, they are there. We are starting over. I cannot leave them. I will not." She would not ask him to stay. He would not ask her to leave. It was the same canyon that had separated them from the beginning. Asher looked at the badge in his hand. He thought of the cold, clean honor it represented. Then he looked at her. He thought of the firelight in the logger's cabin, the feel of her hand in his, the carved pact on his knife. He thought of the dark car. "The Black Alder Valley," he said, his voice rough. "That is a part of the northern stretch, is it not?" Seda looked at him, confused. "I will take the post," he said, his voice finding its strength. "On one condition, that my main station is not some brick building in a town, that I build it myself, on the ridge at the mouth of Black Alder Valley, a protection post, a place for travelers, for anyone who needs help." An outpost," she stammered, the hope in her chest too sudden. "No," Asher said, his gaze locking with hers, closing the distance between them. "Not an outpost, a station, a safe haven." He knew the name as he said it. "I will call it Crossing Moon Station." She did not cry. She did not smile. She simply stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart, and felt the steady, solid beat of the man who had come home. Life flowed back into the high desert, but it was a new, stronger current. Chenoa, the hawk, found her purpose. She took the surplus carbines from the Seas Depot and began to train the women of the valley, not to be soldiers, but to be guardians. She taught them to shoot, to track, and to never, ever be hunted again. Tiva, the guardian, became the valley's leader. She organized patrols to protect the new water lines from the spring. She was the one who mediated disputes, her lariat now a symbol of binding the community together, not of catching men, and Onawa, the girl who had been broken, became the healer. The depot, once a place of terror, was now an orphanage for the children left behind by Drummond's brutal system. Onawa, whose own childhood had been stolen, went there. She took charge of the children, her quiet strength a balm. She taught them to read. She bound their small scrapes. And in the process, she healed herself. There was no violence, no fear, only the steady, gentle work of rebuilding. The first moon of the new season, the crossing moon, rose full and silver over the valley. The entire community gathered at the newly built station. It was not a fort. It was a large, open ranch house, with a warm lantern glowing in every window. The sounds that night were a new kind of music, the low, rhythmic thrum of an Apache water drum blended with the high, sweet notes of a cowboy's guitar. Elspeth and Ouyang Shin shared tea by the fire. Judge Whitlock had sent a letter, read aloud by Asher, praising the courage and resilience of the Black Alder community, and it was countersigned with the silver seal of the federal court. Later, when the music was soft and the children were asleep, Asher and Seda walked away from the light. They followed the path to the creek, the water shining like a silver ribbon under the moon. He took her hand. It was not the desperate, clinging grip of the cabin. It was a comfortable, solid weight, a hand that fit his own. They stopped by the bank, the sound of the water whispering around them. He turned to her, his heart too full for the simple words he knew. He was a man of action, of horses and rifles, but she had taught him a new language. He touched her face, just as he had that first night, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes soft, her lips just slightly parted. He kissed her. It was a soft kiss, slow and deep, a kiss of profound, quiet love. It held all the promises they did not need to say. It was a vow of forever, spoken without a sound. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "Your heart is beating," she whispered, a small smile in her voice. "Like a drum." "It beats for you," he said, and the simple truth of it settled between them. "As real as the mountain?" "It has, I think, since you first stood on my porch. I was afraid that night," she confessed. "And he said. He held her, his arms wrapped around her waist, her arms around his neck. They stood in the silver light, two people who had found in each other a home, a purpose. Theirs was not the love of first, frantic fire. It was the love of the hearth, a steady, abiding warmth that would not go out, a light that would protect not just them, but the entire valley. The west would still have its storms. There would be new winds, new dangers. But on the ridge overlooking Black Alder Valley, Crossing Moon Station had lit its lamp, and every time the coyote wind howled, the four sisters knew that the lonely rancher was no longer lonely at all. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would be honored if you would let us know where in the world you are listening from. Please, leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and give this video a like. And if you can, please support us by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by many more.